The day a man tells you that another woman deserves your home more than you do is the day you discover who he truly is and who you were always meant to become. The divorce papers slid across the polished marble kitchen island and stopped inches from Amelia Carter's hands, the crisp pages whispering against the stone like a quiet storm finally arriving after months of warning clouds. For a moment, she simply looked at them without touching them, the late afternoon sun pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Hale mansion and scattering warm gold across the expensive room they had once designed together. Outside, the hills of Beverly Hills glowed under a perfect California sky, palm trees swaying gently in the breeze, the city stretching toward the Pacific like a promise of endless opportunity. 5 years ago, Amelia had stood in this very kitchen with blueprints rolled under her arm and hope shining in her chest as brightly as the sunlight now dancing across the marble. She had drawn every line of this house herself, every archway and window, every elegant curve of the staircase that spiraled toward the second floor like a ribbon of white stone. The house had been her dream long before it ever carried Richard Hale's name on the deed. Now the dream sat silently between them in the shape of legal documents and cold signatures waiting to be written. Richard leaned against the counter across from her, his tailored charcoal suit as sharp as the expression in his steel-colored eyes. At 38, he was one of the most talked-about real estate billionaires in California, the man magazines called a visionary developer and television anchors described as unstoppable. Amelia knew another version of him, a quieter man who once stayed awake until 3 in the morning listening to her explain why natural light mattered in architecture, a man who used to trace the lines of her sketches with genuine admiration. That version of Richard felt like a stranger now. His voice broke the silence with the calm efficiency of someone closing a business deal. You should read them carefully before signing. Amelia's fingers finally moved, lifting the top page. The words blurred for a moment, not from tears but from the sheer weight of the moment pressing against her chest. Dissolution of marriage. Division of assets. Property transfer. Each sentence carried the sterile tone of lawyers who had never stepped inside the life those sentences were dismantling. She reached the final page where Richard's signature already rested in bold black ink. He had signed without hesitation. Of course he had. Richard Hale never hesitated when he believed he was making the correct investment. Amelia slowly placed the papers back on the marble counter and lifted her gaze toward him. You're serious? The statement came out calm, almost curious, as if she were observing a stranger's decision rather than the collapse of her own marriage. Richard didn't flinch. It's the most practical solution for both of us. Practical. The word echoed through the vast kitchen with chilling precision. Amelia let out a small breath and glanced around the room, noticing details the way architects always do. The golden light touching the glass chandelier, the subtle reflection of the mountains in the tall windows, the soft hum of the refrigerator tucked behind custom walnut panels she had personally selected. Every corner of this house carried her fingerprints, even if her name would soon disappear from its ownership records. Practical, she repeated quietly. Richard straightened and walked a few steps toward her, sliding the papers a little closer across the counter as if completing a simple transaction. Vanessa will be moving in next month, he said. The name landed in the air like a stone dropped into still water. Amelia felt the ripple move through her chest, but her expression remained steady. Richard continued with the same measured tone he used in boardrooms and investor meetings. And frankly, Amelia, my girlfriend deserves this house more than you do. For a second the world seemed to pause. Not explode, not shatter, simply pause, as though time itself needed a moment to consider the weight of those words. Amelia's eyes lowered to the papers again. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. Instead, she reached slowly for the delicate gold band resting on her finger, the wedding ring Richard had placed there 6 years earlier under the bright lights of a Malibu sunset. The metal felt warm from her skin as she slid it free. She placed the ring gently beside the divorce papers. Then she looked back up at the man who believed he had just taken everything from her. What Richard Hale did not yet understand was that the house he had just given away was never truly the most valuable thing Amelia Carter had built. Amelia Carter did not raise her voice, and she did not ask another question because something inside her had already shifted, a quiet realization settling over her like the calm that arrives just after a long storm finally passes. Richard watched her place the wedding ring beside the divorce papers, as if she had simply removed a piece of jewelry that no longer matched her outfit. For a moment he seemed almost confused by the absence of emotion. He had expected anger or pleading, or at the very least disbelief. Instead, Amelia stood with the composed stillness of someone studying a blueprint before beginning construction. She looked around the kitchen once more, not as a wife remembering memories, but as an architect reviewing a completed project. The curved windows she had designed to capture the California sunset glowed softly in the late afternoon light. The 12-foot ceilings allowed the room to breathe in a way most luxury homes never achieved. The marble island stretched nearly 9 feet across the center of the space, a detail she had insisted on even when Richard's contractors complained about the cost. Every decision had once carried excitement and partnership. Now it simply carried clarity. Richard cleared his throat, breaking the quiet. "You will still receive the settlement listed in the documents. The lawyers made sure everything is fair." Amelia let out a small, thoughtful breath. Fair. The word sounded almost academic as she repeated it. She reached for the pen lying neatly beside the papers, the same silver fountain pen Richard used to sign million-dollar development contracts. For a moment the pen hovered above the page, not from hesitation, but from reflection. She remembered the first sketch she had drawn of this house on a yellow legal pad in a tiny apartment downtown, when Richard had nothing more than ambition and a modest construction loan. She remembered him staring at the drawing with genuine wonder and saying that one day the world would know her talent. Amelia signed her name with a smooth, deliberate motion. The ink dried quickly against the legal paper. Richard's shoulders relaxed slightly, as though a complicated negotiation had just concluded successfully. "I think this is best for everyone," he said. Amelia set the pen down and gently pushed the papers back toward him. "Then you should keep them somewhere safe," she replied calmly. Richard gathered the documents with practiced efficiency and slid them into a leather folder. For a brief moment neither of them spoke. The silence in the kitchen felt larger than the room itself, stretching through the tall windows and across the hills beyond the mansion. Amelia turned toward the staircase and walked slowly across the polished floor. Her footsteps echoed softly through the open space. Richard watched her with faint curiosity. "You are leaving already?" he asked. She paused at the base of the staircase and glanced back over her shoulder. The golden sunlight framed her silhouette with quiet dignity. "There is nothing here that belongs to me anymore." Richard did not respond immediately. Perhaps he believed the statement was emotional rather than factual. But Amelia knew the difference. Ownership had never truly been about signatures on paper. Ownership was vision. Ownership was creation. Ownership was the ability to imagine something where nothing existed before. Amelia walked upstairs to the master bedroom, where the late afternoon light painted long shadows across the wide hardwood floors. The room still carried the subtle scent of cedar and linen that she had chosen years ago, because she believed a home should feel calm the moment someone entered it. Her suitcase sat in the back of the closet, the same suitcase she had used during architecture conferences in Chicago and Seattle. She packed slowly and methodically. A few professional sketches. Her laptop. A small leather notebook filled with ideas for buildings that had never been constructed. She did not take anything else. Not the designer dresses hanging neatly in rows. Not the jewelry resting inside velvet boxes. Not the expensive handbags lined across the shelf. None of those things had been the reason she stayed here, and none of them were the reason she was leaving. Downstairs, Richard's phone rang, and his voice carried faintly through the open space as he answered with the confident tone investors recognized from television interviews. Amelia closed the suitcase and zipped it carefully. She took one last look around the bedroom and then walked toward the stairs with the same steady composure she had shown when signing the papers. When she reached the front door, the evening air had begun to cool the hillside. The sky stretched wide and clear above Los Angeles, glowing with the quiet colors of sunset. Amelia stepped outside and closed the door gently behind her. Inside the mansion, Richard Hale believed he had just secured the future he wanted. Outside on the long curved driveway, Amelia Carter lifted her suitcase into the trunk of a simple rideshare car waiting at the curb. As the car pulled away from the mansion, she looked through the window one final time, not with regret, but with the calm certainty of someone who understood that the most important structures in life were never the ones built from marble and glass, but the ones built from courage and imagination. The rideshare car merged onto Sunset Boulevard as evening settled across Los Angeles, the city lights beginning to blink on one by one like quiet promises scattered across the hills. Amelia Carter sat in the back seat with her suitcase beside her, watching the familiar skyline slowly unfold beyond the window. For the first time in years, she noticed how wide the city felt, how alive it seemed beyond the walls of the mansion she had just left behind. When the driver asked politely where she was headed, she gave an address in downtown Los Angeles, a small apartment building near the Arts District that she had quietly leased 3 weeks earlier. Something in Richard's distant behavior had stirred a quiet instinct inside her long before the divorce papers appeared on the marble kitchen counter. Architects understood warning signs better than most people. Hairline fractures in a structure rarely appeared overnight. They began with pressure, with imbalance, with tiny shifts that slowly weakened the foundation. Amelia had felt those shifts long before Richard spoke the words that ended their marriage. The car passed rows of glowing restaurants and crowded sidewalks where people laughed over late dinners and music drifted through the warm California air. Life continued everywhere around her with effortless motion. It felt strange and yet liberating to realize that the world did not collapse when one chapter ended. 40 minutes later, the car turned onto a narrow street lined with renovated warehouses and modern loft buildings. Amelia stepped out and lifted her suitcase onto the sidewalk while the driver offered a friendly smile before pulling away into the evening traffic. The building in front of her stood only 4 stories tall, modest compared to the hillside mansion she had left behind, but its clean brick facade and tall industrial windows carried a quiet character she appreciated immediately. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of fresh paint and polished wood. A single pendant light hung above a small reception desk, and soft jazz music drifted through hidden speakers. Amelia rode the elevator to the 3rd floor and unlocked the door to apartment 3B. The space measured just under 700 square feet, barely 1/10 the size of the mansion in Beverly Hills. Yet the moment she stepped inside, she felt something unexpected settle in her chest. Peace. The living area opened into a simple kitchen with white cabinets and brushed steel appliances. 2 tall windows faced west toward the skyline, where the final colors of sunset painted the clouds in shades of amber and violet. The apartment was almost empty except for a drafting table positioned near the window and a simple couch against the far wall. Amelia placed her suitcase beside the couch and walked slowly toward the drafting table. On its surface lay several rolled sheets of architectural paper held together with a black elastic band. She removed the band and spread the drawings across the table. These were designs she had never shown Richard. Projects she had imagined during quiet evenings when he believed she was simply reviewing construction budgets for his developments. Sustainable housing complexes, community cultural centers, urban gardens built above mixed-use structures, buildings designed not only for profit but for people. Amelia traced one of the lines with the tip of her finger, following the curve of a rooftop garden designed to collect rainwater and sunlight in equal measure. A small smile touched her lips. The mansion on the hill had once been her proudest creation, but it had also been built under someone else's name, someone else's ambition. These drawings were different. These belonged entirely to her. Outside the windows, the city lights grew brighter, stretching across Los Angeles like a living constellation. Amelia pulled out the chair beside the drafting table and opened her laptop. The screen illuminated the room with a cool, steady glow as she began organizing digital files and sketches she had carefully saved over the past year. A quiet determination moved through her hands with each click of the keyboard. She was not running from the life she had lost. She was stepping toward the life she had always intended to build. In Beverly Hills, Richard Hale would soon welcome Vanessa into the mansion he believed symbolized his success. But several miles away in a modest apartment above a quiet downtown street, Amelia Carter was already laying the first lines of something far greater than a house on a hill. She was designing a future that carried only one signature. Morning arrived quietly over downtown Los Angeles, pale sunlight sliding through the tall windows of apartment 3B and stretching across the hardwood floor like the first lines of a new sketch. Amelia Carter had fallen asleep at the drafting table sometime after midnight, surrounded by open sketches and glowing laptop screens that still displayed architectural models rotating slowly in digital space. When she opened her eyes, the city was already waking outside. Traffic humming along the streets below and distant construction cranes turning slowly against the bright California sky. For a moment she remained still, absorbing the unfamiliar silence of her new home. In Beverly Hills, mornings had always begun with distant landscapers, automatic coffee machines, and the quiet rhythm of a house that ran like a carefully programmed system. Here there was only the soft sound of the city breathing beyond the windows. Amelia stood and stretched slightly before gathering the drawings scattered across the table. She moved with calm efficiency, the same quiet focus that had once impressed professors during her years at the University of Southern California School of Architecture. Discipline had always been her greatest strength. It was the reason she had graduated at the top of her class. It was the reason she had once helped transform a small construction company into a billion-dollar development empire. And now it would become the foundation of everything she built next. She poured a cup of black coffee from a small machine on the kitchen counter and carried it back toward the drafting table, studying one of the larger blueprints with thoughtful attention. The design represented a mixed-use housing complex built around a central public garden, a project she had imagined after visiting community spaces in Portland several years earlier. The structure allowed natural sunlight to reach every apartment, while rooftop gardens helped regulate temperature and collect rainwater for irrigation. It was elegant, sustainable, and above all human. Amelia opened her laptop and began reviewing local development proposals released by the City of Los Angeles Planning Department. Her eyes scanned through zoning updates and public infrastructure initiatives with careful interest. One document immediately caught her attention: a redevelopment proposal for a neglected industrial block near the Los Angeles River. The project requested innovative housing solutions from independent architects and small design firms willing to propose sustainable concepts. Amelia leaned slightly closer to the screen, reading every line with growing concentration. The project was not large enough to attract the giant development corporations Richard usually competed with, but it was large enough to become something meaningful. A foundation. A first step. She downloaded the proposal documents and created a new project folder on her computer. The clock on the wall showed 8:15 in the morning when she opened a fresh digital canvas and began drawing the first structural lines of a concept that had been quietly forming in her mind for months. Outside the windows, sunlight climbed higher over the city skyline, reflecting off glass towers and casting long beams of light across the river district several miles away, where abandoned warehouses waited for someone to imagine their future. Amelia worked steadily for hours, adjusting building elevations, sketching public walkways, shaping gardens between residential spaces so that families could gather beneath open sky. The design felt alive with purpose. Around midday, she stepped back from the screen and studied the emerging structure with thoughtful satisfaction. It was not grand like the mansion in Beverly Hills, but it carried something far more powerful. It carried intention. Amelia saved the file and submitted a preliminary inquiry through the city development portal. As the confirmation message appeared on the screen, she felt a quiet certainty settle over her thoughts. The world she had helped build beside Richard Hale had been driven by profit and prestige. The world she was designing now would be built from vision and independence. Outside the windows, the city of Los Angeles moved forward under the bright afternoon sun, unaware that in a modest apartment above a quiet downtown street, a new architect had just taken the first step toward reshaping its future. The confirmation email from the city of Los Angeles arrived the following morning at exactly 9:12 in Amelia Carter's inbox. Its subject line simple and professional, yet carrying a quiet weight that made her pause before opening it. The city planning department had received her preliminary concept submission and invited her to present a full proposal in 3 weeks at the Municipal Redevelopment Review meeting. Amelia read the message twice to be certain she understood it correctly. Independent architects were rarely invited this early in the evaluation process unless the concept had already caught someone's attention. She closed the email slowly and leaned back in her chair, allowing a small breath to escape as sunlight filtered through the tall industrial windows of her apartment. Outside, downtown Los Angeles moved with its usual rhythm of morning traffic and construction crews, beginning another day of reshaping the skyline. Amelia turned her attention back to the drawings spread across the drafting table. Over the past 2 days, the concept had grown steadily from a simple housing idea into a complete urban design. 3 mid-rise residential buildings surrounded a central garden courtyard filled with native trees and walking paths. Ground-level storefronts offered space for small local businesses, while rooftop gardens collected rainwater and solar energy. Every detail served a purpose that extended beyond profit margins. Amelia lifted a pencil and added several new structural notes along the southern elevation of the main building. She had spent years designing projects that carried Richard Hale's company logo across the blueprints. This time the drawings carried only her signature in the lower right corner. The quiet independence of that single name felt more valuable than any title she had once held in the corporate offices of Hale Development Group. Around midday, Amelia gathered her sketches into a large portfolio folder and stepped outside onto the busy sidewalk of the Arts District. The warm California sun reflected off brick walls and glass storefronts as cyclists and pedestrians moved easily through the neighborhood. A few blocks away stood a renovated warehouse that now served as a shared architecture studio where independent designers rented workspace by the month. Amelia had signed a small desk lease there earlier in the week, knowing that real projects required collaboration as well as vision. Inside the studio, the air carried the faint scent of coffee and drafting paper. Several architects worked quietly at long wooden tables, while computer screens displayed three-dimensional building models rotating slowly in digital space. Amelia walked toward the desk assigned to her near a large window overlooking the street. As she opened her portfolio, a voice spoke from the neighboring table with friendly curiosity. "That looks like serious work for a Monday morning." Amelia turned to see a tall man in his early 40s adjusting a pair of glasses while studying her sketches with professional interest. His name tag on the desk read Daniel Brooks. She recognized the name immediately. Daniel Brooks was known in Los Angeles architecture circles for designing environmentally innovative public spaces along the West Coast. Amelia offered a polite smile. "A redevelopment proposal for the River District." Daniel leaned slightly closer to examine the drawings more carefully. His expression shifted from casual curiosity to genuine respect as he followed the lines of her design across the page. "Whoever approved you to submit this concept has good instincts," he said thoughtfully. "This could transform that entire neighborhood." Amelia appreciated the straightforward assessment. "I am hoping the city planners feel the same way." Daniel nodded once and returned to his workstation, though his tone carried quiet encouragement as he spoke again. "If they do not, they are missing something important." Amelia continued working through the afternoon, refining the layout of the residential buildings and adjusting pedestrian walkways that connected the complex to nearby transit stops. Hours passed with steady focus until the sun began lowering toward the horizon beyond the downtown towers. As Amelia packed her drawings back into the portfolio, she noticed Daniel glancing once more at the concept on her desk. "Presentation day is going to be interesting," he said with an easy smile. Amelia closed the folder and stepped toward the door as evening settled across the city. Several miles away in Beverly Hills, the mansion she had designed stood illuminated by golden lights and manicured gardens, a symbol of success that Richard Hale proudly shared with his new companion. But here in the creative energy of a downtown studio, Amelia Carter was quietly building something far more powerful than a house on a hill. She was building momentum. 3 weeks moved quickly in downtown Los Angeles, measured not by calendar days, but by long hours of focused work under the soft glow of drafting lamps and computer screens that stayed lit well past midnight. Amelia Carter spent nearly every waking moment refining the redevelopment proposal that had quietly captured the attention of the city planning department. The concept had evolved into a fully realized vision. 3 8-story residential buildings arranged around a central public garden stretching nearly 200 feet across the property, pedestrian walkways lined with native oak trees, solar glass integrated into the rooftop structures, and ground-level spaces reserved for local shops, cafes, and community workshops. Each adjustment to the design carried Amelia's familiar precision, the kind of careful thinking that once helped Richard Hale transform a small construction firm into a nationally recognized development company. Now that same discipline served only one purpose: proving that her vision could stand on its own. On the morning of the presentation, the downtown architecture studio felt unusually quiet as Amelia organized the final renderings into a large black portfolio case. Outside the windows, sunlight reflected off the glass towers of the financial district, while traffic moved steadily along the streets below. Daniel Brooks arrived a few minutes later carrying a travel mug and wearing the relaxed confidence of someone who had presented ideas to city officials many times before. He paused beside Amelia's desk and glanced at the neatly arranged architectural boards displaying detailed, three-dimensional models of her project. "You are ready," he said with a calm smile that sounded more like certainty than encouragement. Amelia closed the portfolio case and lifted it carefully from the desk. "I hope the city thinks so." Daniel studied the presentation boards one last time before nodding slowly. "They will notice something important about your design," he replied. "It solves problems that most developers ignore." Amelia appreciated the observation but did not allow herself to dwell on it. Confidence was useful, but preparation mattered more. 20 minutes later, she stepped into a rideshare car that carried her toward Los Angeles City Hall, where the redevelopment review meeting would take place. The building's tall white tower rose above the surrounding district like a quiet monument to the city's long history of reinvention. Inside the council chamber, several architects and development representatives were already setting up digital displays and presentation models along the front of the room. Amelia recognized a few of the larger corporate firms immediately. Their teams wore tailored suits and spoke confidently about investment partnerships and construction timelines. For a brief moment, Amelia felt the familiar awareness of being the smallest competitor in the room. But that awareness quickly settled into something stronger than doubt. It settled into focus. When her name was called, she stepped forward carrying the portfolio case and placed her presentation boards onto the display stand at the center of the chamber. The city planning panel sat in a curved row of seats across the room, their expressions thoughtful as they studied the digital rendering that appeared on the large screen behind her. Amelia began explaining the project in clear, steady language, describing how the buildings captured natural light, how the gardens provided cooling shade during the summer months, and how the walkways connected residents directly to nearby transit lines along the river district. The presentation moved smoothly through structural diagrams and environmental studies until one of the planners leaned forward with visible interest. "Your proposal prioritizes community access in ways we rarely see in private development plans," the planner said thoughtfully. Amelia nodded once. "Cities grow strongest when architecture serves people first." A quiet murmur moved through the room as the panel reviewed the final rendering of the garden courtyard surrounded by residential balconies filled with sunlight and greenery. Several of the corporate developers shifted slightly in their seats. The concept was different from the usual luxury complexes that filled most proposals. When Amelia finished speaking, she closed the portfolio and stepped back from the display stand. The planners exchanged several brief comments before the chairperson addressed the room again. "Miss Carter, your proposal will advance to the final development evaluation stage next month." The words were delivered with professional calm, yet they carried a quiet weight that echoed through Amelia's thoughts. The smallest firm in the room had just moved forward in the competition. As Amelia gathered her presentation boards and stepped outside into the bright afternoon sunlight of the Civic Plaza, the city of Los Angeles stretched wide and alive around her. Several miles away on the hills above Beverly Hills, the mansion she once designed still stood as a symbol of Richard Hale's success. But on the streets below City Hall, a different story had just begun to take shape, one that carried Amelia Carter's name at the foundation. The afternoon sun hung low over Los Angeles when Amelia Carter stepped onto the wide stone plaza outside City Hall, the air warm and bright with the steady rhythm of a city that never paused for anyone's personal victories or failures. People moved across the plaza carrying briefcases, coffee cups, and quiet ambitions of their own, while traffic hummed along Spring Street beyond the rows of palm trees. Amelia stood for a moment beside the fountain at the center of the courtyard, allowing the sound of moving water to settle her thoughts. Advancing to the final stage of the redevelopment evaluation meant far more than professional recognition. It meant the possibility of turning her independent vision into something real, something that would exist in steel, glass, and sunlight across the river district. Her phone vibrated gently in her hand. A message from Daniel Brooks appeared on the screen. How did the presentation go? Amelia allowed herself a small smile before typing a short reply. Final evaluation stage next month. 3 seconds later the phone buzzed again. I knew it. The message carried the quiet confidence Daniel seemed to express without effort. Amelia slipped the phone back into her bag and began walking toward the metro station several blocks away, her mind already returning to the project's next phase. Winning the redevelopment contract would require more than vision. It would require detailed financial modeling, structural engineering consultations, and a construction partnership capable of turning her design into reality. She would need to move carefully, strategically, the same way she once helped guide Richard Hale's earliest developments through complicated zoning approvals and city negotiations. The difference now was that every decision belonged to her alone. Meanwhile, several miles away in a sleek glass conference room overlooking Beverly Hills, Richard Hale sat at the head of a long walnut table surrounded by executives from Hale Development Group. Architectural renderings for a new luxury condominium tower glowed across a digital display screen, while investors studied projected revenue figures along the lower edge of the presentation board. Richard listened with only partial attention as one of his project managers described construction timelines and financing partnerships. His phone rested quietly beside his tablet computer until a notification from a business news application flashed across the screen. The headline was brief, but immediately caught his attention. Independent architect advances in City River District redevelopment competition. Richard tapped the notification almost absent-mindedly, expecting another routine industry update. Instead, a small photograph appeared at the top of the article. Amelia Carter stood beside a digital rendering of a residential garden complex, her expression calm and professional beneath the headline describing her proposal as one of the most innovative concepts submitted for the city's urban renewal initiative. Richard stared at the image for a moment longer than necessary. The room around him continued discussing profit projections and investor partnerships, but the words blurred into background noise. He had not expected to see Amelia's name connected to a major redevelopment proposal so soon after the divorce. Vanessa's voice broke into his thoughts from the seat beside him, where she had been reviewing design samples for the Beverly Hills mansion's interior renovations. Is something wrong? Richard set the phone face down on the table and straightened his posture slightly. No, just industry news. The meeting resumed its steady pace while outside the conference room the late afternoon sun cast long golden reflections across the hills of Beverly Hills. Several miles away in downtown Los Angeles, Amelia Carter stepped out of the metro station and walked toward the architecture studio where her drafting table waited beside the window. Inside the studio, the familiar scent of paper and fresh coffee welcomed her back into the quiet energy of creative work. Amelia placed her portfolio on the desk and looked once more at the architectural renderings glowing softly across her laptop screen. The path ahead would not be easy. Larger development firms still dominated the final evaluation stage, and their financial resources far exceeded her own. But Amelia Carter had something they could not easily replicate. She had lived through the collapse of one carefully built life and discovered that vision could survive even when everything else disappeared. As the evening lights of Los Angeles began flickering on outside the tall windows of the studio, Amelia leaned forward and began refining the next set of structural drawings. The future of the River District was still undecided, but one truth had already become clear. The woman who once designed a mansion for someone else's success was now designing something far larger for herself. The following weeks unfolded with the steady momentum of a city rising toward summer. And for Amelia Carter, each day followed a rhythm shaped by focus, discipline, and quiet determination. Morning light streamed through the tall windows of the architecture studio while the sounds of downtown Los Angeles drifted upward from the streets below, car horns echoing between buildings and construction cranes turning slowly against the bright blue sky. Amelia arrived early every morning with a notebook in hand and a clear plan for the hours ahead. The redevelopment proposal had moved into its most demanding phase, and every detail of the design now required deeper structural analysis, cost projections, and environmental validation before the final evaluation. Meeting with the City Planning Council. On the drafting table beside her laptop, the architectural drawings had grown more complex. filled with carefully measured elevations and material specifications that translated imagination into something engineers could one day build. Amelia studied each section with careful attention, adjusting the orientation of residential balconies to maximize natural light while maintaining shade during the hottest hours of the afternoon. The garden courtyard at the center of the complex had also evolved into something more sophisticated. Native oak trees would line the main walkway, while a shallow water channel would guide collected rainwater through a filtration system beneath the landscape before storing it for irrigation during dry months. It was architecture designed not only to stand but to breathe with the environment around it. Daniel Brooks often glanced over from his workstation nearby, occasionally offering thoughtful suggestions that improved structural flow or pedestrian access. One afternoon, he paused beside Amelia's desk holding a digital tablet displaying a three-dimensional model of the project. "If you rotate the central walkway by 12 degrees, he said calmly while adjusting the model with his fingers, you will create a natural sight line toward the river park that the city is planning next year." Amelia studied the model carefully before nodding once. That would also improve afternoon airflow through the courtyard. Daniel smiled slightly as he handed the tablet back. Exactly. The collaboration remained professional and respectful, yet it carried the quiet understanding shared by architects who recognized genuine vision when they saw it. Meanwhile, the redevelopment competition had begun attracting increasing attention across the city's development industry. Articles appeared in business publications discussing the innovative concepts being considered for the River District renewal. Several of the larger corporate firms involved in the competition had already begun promoting their projects through media campaigns and investor presentations. Amelia ignored the noise surrounding the process and continued refining the design itself. She understood something many developers often forgot. Buildings were not created through headlines or publicity. They were created through careful thought and patient work. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the downtown skyline, Amelia stepped outside onto the narrow balcony attached to the architecture studio. The city stretched wide beneath the fading light, glass towers reflecting shades of amber and gold, while the distant hills softened into evening shadows. Daniel joined her a moment later, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the cafe across the street. He handed one to Amelia with an easy nod toward the glowing skyline. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "a lot of architects spend their entire careers hoping to design something that actually changes how people experience a neighborhood." Amelia rested her hands against the balcony railing while looking out across the city she had grown up admiring. "Cities are stories written in concrete and steel," she replied quietly. "Every building becomes part of the next chapter." Daniel took a slow sip of his coffee before glancing back toward the drafting tables inside the studio. "Your project might become one of those chapters." Amelia did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched as the lights along the Los Angeles River slowly began turning on in the distance, illuminating the quiet industrial district that had waited for decades to become something new. Across the hills of Beverly Hills, Richard Hale continued expanding his development empire with projects that carried impressive price tags and polished marketing campaigns. But here, in the quiet determination of a downtown studio, Amelia Carter was shaping something very different. She was not building another monument to luxury. She was building a place where a community could begin again, and with every careful line drawn across the blueprints, she moved one step closer to turning that vision into reality. The final evaluation meeting for the River District redevelopment arrived on a bright Tuesday morning when the sky above Los Angeles stretched clear and wide like a canvas waiting for the city's next story to be written. Amelia Carter stepped out of the rideshare car in front of City Hall with the same quiet composure she had carried into every design review throughout her career. The tall white tower of the building rose above the Civic Plaza, its stone facade reflecting sunlight across the fountains and palm trees that lined the entrance walkway. In her hands, Amelia carried the black portfolio case that now held the most refined version of her proposal, a collection of drawings and digital renderings that represented months of focused work and years of accumulated experience. Inside the council chamber, the atmosphere felt more intense than during the earlier review session. Representatives from several large development corporations filled the seats along the side of the room, each waiting for the final decision that would determine who would lead the transformation of the long-neglected River District. Large display screens glowed across the front wall, while city planners arranged documents across the curved council desk. Amelia took a seat near the front row and placed her portfolio carefully on the chair beside her. Daniel Brooks arrived a few moments later and offered a quiet nod of encouragement before sitting nearby. Across the chamber, several executives from Hale Development Group entered the room in conversation with one another, their tailored suits and confident posture reflecting the reputation of a firm accustomed to winning major projects. Richard Hale himself followed a moment later, reviewing something on a digital tablet as he walked toward the reserved seating area for corporate developers. He did not immediately notice Amelia seated across the room, but when he finally looked up, his attention paused for a brief second as recognition crossed his expression. Amelia met his gaze calmly before turning her attention back toward the front of the chamber. Whatever existed between them now belonged entirely to the past. The meeting began with formal introductions from the City Planning Council before each finalist presented their completed proposal. Corporate firms described luxury residential towers, high-end retail districts, and investment projections designed to attract international buyers. Their presentations were polished and confident, supported by teams of financial advisors and marketing specialists. When Amelia's name was called, the chamber grew noticeably quieter. She walked to the front of the room and opened the digital presentation on the large screen behind her. The image that appeared showed the River District transformed into a living neighborhood centered around green space and pedestrian access rather than private luxury towers. Amelia spoke with the same calm clarity she had practiced during weeks of preparation, explaining how the residential buildings captured natural sunlight while maintaining energy efficiency, how the community gardens encouraged local food growth, and how the design integrated directly with the city's existing transit network. As the presentation continued, several council members leaned forward with visible interest while architectural diagrams displayed the environmental sustainability features built into every structure. When Amelia reached the final rendering of the central garden courtyard, the room remained silent for a few seconds longer than expected. One of the planners finally spoke. "Your proposal appears to prioritize long-term community value over short-term financial return." Amelia nodded once. Cities grow strongest when development serves both. The council members exchanged thoughtful glances before thanking her for the presentation. Amelia returned to her seat while the final corporate firm completed its proposal. Nearly 20 minutes later, the chairperson of the Planning Council stood and addressed the room with the official announcement. The redevelopment contract for the River District would be awarded to the proposal that best balanced sustainability, community access, and long-term economic stability. Amelia listened quietly as the chairperson opened the final document containing the council's decision. Outside the tall windows of City Hall, the bright California sunlight reflected across the Civic Plaza, while traffic moved steadily through the streets below. Inside the chamber, the future of an entire neighborhood was about to be decided, and Amelia Carter sat calmly in the front row, knowing that no matter what the outcome might be, she had already proven something far more important than victory. She had proven that vision built with integrity could stand confidently even in a room filled with giants. The council chamber remained completely still as the chairperson unfolded the final document, the soft sound of paper echoing lightly through the quiet room. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of City Hall, reflecting across the polished floor while every person seated inside the chamber waited for the decision that would shape the future of the River District. Amelia Carter sat with her hands folded calmly in her lap, her attention steady on the council desk at the front of the room. Across the chamber, Richard Hale leaned slightly forward in his chair, his expression composed yet focused in the way he always appeared during high-stakes negotiations. The chairperson adjusted his glasses and began speaking with the clear, measured tone of someone accustomed to delivering decisions that affected entire communities. He thanked the finalists for their time, acknowledging the quality of the proposals and the importance of the redevelopment project for the city of Los Angeles. Each word seemed to stretch the silence a little longer. Finally, he reached the final page of the document and looked up at the room. After careful review of sustainability impact, community accessibility, financial feasibility, and long-term development potential, the council has reached its decision. Several heads lifted slightly across the chamber. Amelia felt the quiet rhythm of her heartbeat, but her expression remained calm. The same composed focus she carried into every architectural presentation. The chairperson continued. The redevelopment contract for the Los Angeles River District will be awarded to Amelia Carter and her community-centered development proposal. For a brief moment the room remained silent as the announcement settled across the chamber like a ripple moving through still water. Then a quiet wave of conversation began spreading among the observers and development representatives seated along the side rows. Amelia did not move immediately. She allowed the words to register slowly, understanding the significance of what had just happened. Months earlier she had stepped out of a mansion in Beverly Hills with nothing but a suitcase and a portfolio of unfinished ideas. Now the city of Los Angeles had placed an entire neighborhood's future in her hands. Daniel Brooks leaned toward her slightly with a warm expression of genuine respect. "Congratulations," he said quietly. "You just changed the direction of that entire district." Amelia offered a small, grateful smile before standing as the council invited her forward to finalize the development agreement. As she walked toward the front of the chamber, the large digital screen behind the council desk displayed the final rendering of her design. The garden courtyard glowed with sunlight between residential balconies filled with greenery, while pedestrian pathways connected the buildings to the nearby river park. It was no longer just an idea on paper. It was a project that would soon rise from the ground. Amelia signed the official contract using the pen provided by the council clerk, her signature appearing clearly beside the city seal. Across the chamber, Richard Hale watched the moment with quiet attention. For the first time since their divorce, he seemed to study Amelia not as a former partner, but as a professional equal standing at the center of a major development decision. The meeting concluded shortly afterward as reporters and city officials began gathering around Amelia to discuss the next steps of the redevelopment project. Outside the tall doors of City Hall, the bright afternoon sunlight filled the civic plaza where fountains sparkled beneath rows of palm trees. Amelia stepped out onto the plaza with the signed agreement folder held carefully in her hands. The city stretched wide before her, alive with movement and possibility. Several months earlier, Richard Hale had believed that giving the mansion to another woman would remove Amelia from the world they once built together. Instead, it had done something very different. It had set her free to build something greater. Somewhere along the river district, construction cranes would soon rise above the skyline, marking the beginning of a new neighborhood designed not for exclusivity, but for community. And standing in the sunlight outside City Hall, Amelia Carter understood that the foundation of that future had begun the moment she chose to walk away and design her own destiny. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent across the skyline when Amelia Carter finished speaking with the final group of reporters gathered near the steps of City Hall. Cameras flashed occasionally as journalists recorded notes about the redevelopment project that had just been awarded to an independent architect whose name many of them had not heard until that morning. Amelia answered each question with the same calm professionalism she carried into every presentation, explaining how the River District project would prioritize community space, environmental sustainability, and long-term urban growth. When the final interview concluded, she stepped away from the small crowd and walked toward the quieter side of the civic plaza where a row of tall palm trees cast long shadows across the pavement. For the first time since the announcement, she allowed herself a moment of stillness. The signed agreement folder rested lightly in her hands, its simple weight representing months of determination and years of quiet preparation that had begun long before the world noticed her work. Behind her, the city continued moving forward with its usual rhythm of traffic, conversations, and distant construction sounds echoing through the downtown streets. Amelia turned slightly toward the plaza fountain, watching the water ripple gently in the afternoon light. "You built something remarkable today." The familiar voice came from behind her with a tone that carried both recognition and something deeper that had not existed between them for a long time. Amelia turned slowly to see Richard Hale standing a few feet away, his posture composed yet noticeably quieter than the confident developer who once dominated every room he entered. The business meeting crowd had mostly dispersed, and for the first time since the council announcement, they stood without observers between them. Richard held his phone loosely in one hand, but made no attempt to check it. His attention remained entirely on Amelia. I read the project details after the announcement, he continued calmly. It is one of the most thoughtful designs I have seen for urban redevelopment. Amelia listened without interruption. Compliments had once been common during the early years of their marriage when they worked together on projects that carried his company's name across every blueprint. Now the words sounded different, not because they lacked sincerity, but because the foundation of their relationship had changed. She nodded once with polite acknowledgement. The city deserves something better than another luxury tower. Richard gave a small, thoughtful smile as he glanced across the civic plaza toward the skyline beyond. You always believed that. The moment stretched quietly between them, filled with the unspoken understanding of everything that had happened since the day he placed divorce papers across the marble kitchen counter. Richard finally spoke again, his voice slightly softer than before. When I saw your name on the project announcement, I realized something I should have understood much earlier. Amelia waited patiently, her expression calm yet attentive. Richard met her gaze directly. You were never just helping build my company. You were building your own future. The honesty in his words carried no argument, no attempt to rewrite the past. It sounded instead like the recognition of a truth that had taken time to surface. Amelia allowed a small reflective breath before responding. Sometimes people only discover their direction when something forces them to walk away from where they thought they belonged. Richard nodded slowly, accepting the meaning behind her words. For a moment, he looked as though he might say more, perhaps something about regret or missed chances. Instead, he simply offered a respectful smile. The River District will be better because of your vision. Amelia thanked him quietly and turned toward the street where a rideshare car waited near the curb. As she walked away from the plaza, the late afternoon sunlight followed her across the sidewalk, illuminating the path ahead through the busy downtown streets. Behind her, Richard remained near the fountain watching the city skyline, where construction cranes would soon begin reshaping the River District. He understood now that the most valuable thing he had once possessed was never the mansion on the hillside or the company that carried his name. It had been the creative mind of the woman who had quietly designed the future while everyone else was focused on profit. And as Amelia Carter stepped into the waiting car and looked out toward the bright horizon of Los Angeles, she knew that the story she was building now belonged entirely to her. The evening traffic flowed steadily through downtown Los Angeles as Amelia Carter's car moved along the wide boulevard toward the Arts District, the golden light of sunset reflecting across glass towers and long rows of palm trees. The city seemed different now, not because the buildings had changed, but because her place within it had quietly transformed. Only a few months earlier, she had left a mansion in Beverly Hills carrying little more than a suitcase and a portfolio of unfinished ideas. Now the agreement folder resting beside her in the back seat represented a project that would soon reshape an entire neighborhood along the Los Angeles River. The car turned onto a familiar street lined with converted warehouses and art studios before stopping near the architecture workspace, where Amelia had spent countless hours refining the design that had just earned the city's confidence. She stepped out onto the sidewalk and paused for a moment as the evening air carried the soft sounds of music from a nearby cafe and the distant rhythm of construction crews finishing their work for the day. Inside the studio, several desk lamps glowed across the room where architects continued working late, their screens filled with rotating building models and detailed blueprints. Daniel Brooks looked up from his workstation when Amelia entered and immediately recognized the quiet expression of accomplishment in her posture. He stood and walked over with a warm smile that carried genuine respect rather than surprise. The city planning office just released the official announcement online, he said while gesturing toward a screen displaying the news article. Your design is already being discussed across half the architecture forums in California. Amelia set the agreement folder gently on her desk and glanced at the article headline displayed across the monitor. The digital rendering of the River District Garden Courtyard filled the screen with bright greenery and open walkways beneath the clear California sky. Seeing the design presented as a real project rather than a concept drawing brought a quiet sense of fulfillment that words could not fully describe. Daniel leaned casually against the desk beside her. You realize that construction planning will begin sooner than most people expect, he said thoughtfully. Developers are going to start asking who you plan to partner with for engineering and project management. Amelia nodded slowly. I know. She looked across the room toward the large drafting table where the earliest version of the design had first taken shape weeks earlier. At that time, the project had been nothing more than a possibility supported by determination and long hours of work. Now it had become something far more substantial, a responsibility. Daniel followed her gaze toward the table and spoke again with quiet seriousness. If you need help assembling the right team, I know several structural engineers who respect work like this. Amelia appreciated the offer. The River District project would require collaboration between architects, environmental specialists, and construction firms capable of translating drawings into living spaces where families would eventually build their lives. She closed the laptop displaying the article and looked once more at the glowing skyline visible through the tall studio windows. The lights of Los Angeles stretched across the horizon like a living constellation, each building representing the work of people who once imagined something new where empty land had existed before. Cities grow through partnerships, she said calmly. Daniel smiled slightly. Then it sounds like the next chapter has already started. Amelia gathered the design sketches into a large portfolio case before turning off the desk lamp beside her workstation. Outside the studio, the evening had grown deeper as streetlights illuminated the sidewalks and restaurants filled with people enjoying the warm California night. Across the hills of Beverly Hills, the mansion she once designed remained a symbol of a life that no longer belonged to her. But in the quiet streets of downtown Los Angeles, the future she was creating had already begun taking shape. And as Amelia Carter walked into the night carrying the blueprints of a neighborhood that would soon rise beside the river, she understood that success was never about reclaiming something lost. It was about building something stronger in its place. 6 months later, the River District looked completely different beneath the bright California sky. Construction cranes rose above the skyline like quiet giants guiding the transformation of an area that had once been filled with silent warehouses and empty streets. Steel frameworks stretched upward from newly poured foundations while teams of engineers and builders moved carefully across the site with the focused rhythm of a project that had finally moved from drawings into reality. Amelia Carter stood on a temporary viewing platform overlooking the construction zone, a hard hat resting lightly in her hands as she studied the progress with calm satisfaction. The central garden courtyard had already begun to take shape in the middle of the development site, its curved pathways outlined with wooden forms where concrete would soon be poured. Rows of young oak trees waited nearby, ready to be planted along the walkways exactly where Amelia had first imagined them months earlier at her drafting table. The project had grown into a collaborative effort involving architects, environmental planners, structural engineers, and local community leaders who all believed the River District deserved something better than another collection of luxury towers. Daniel Brooks stood beside her on the platform reviewing a digital construction tablet that displayed the building timeline. The first residential structure should reach the 5th floor by early fall, he said while adjusting the screen so Amelia could see the progress markers. At this pace, we will open the garden courtyard ahead of schedule. Amelia nodded slowly while looking out across the site, where sunlight reflected off steel beams and glass panels stacked along the perimeter. The city skyline stretched beyond the construction zone, its familiar towers rising against the wide blue horizon of Los Angeles. For a moment, she allowed herself to remember the day she had stepped out of a mansion in Beverly Hills carrying nothing but determination and a portfolio of unfinished ideas. That moment had once felt uncertain. Now it felt like the first line of a blueprint that had guided everything that followed. Daniel lowered the tablet slightly and looked across the site with quiet respect. You turned an empty industrial block into the future center of a community, he said thoughtfully. Amelia smiled gently. Cities grow when people believe something better is possible. Later that afternoon, a small gathering of city officials and neighborhood representatives arrived to review the progress of the development. The mayor spoke briefly about the importance of projects that balanced innovation with community access, while reporters captured images of the rising structures and landscape gardens that would soon welcome families, local businesses, and public events along the river. Amelia listened politely before stepping aside to allow the construction teams to continue their work. As the sun began lowering toward the horizon, the site slowly quieted, leaving only the steady hum of equipment and the distant sound of traffic along the nearby bridge. Amelia remained on the platform a little longer, watching the golden light settle across the unfinished courtyard where the first trees would soon be planted. Several miles away in Beverly Hills, the mansion she once designed still stood proudly above the hillside, a symbol of wealth and success that belonged to another chapter of her life. But here along the Los Angeles River, something far more meaningful was rising from the ground. A place designed not for exclusivity, but for belonging. A neighborhood built from vision rather than ownership. As the final workers finished their day and the evening lights of the city began flickering on across the skyline, Amelia placed the hard hat gently on the platform railing and looked out across the growing district one more time. The future she was building no longer carried the weight of the past. It carried possibility. And in the quiet glow of sunset across the river district, Amelia Carter understood a simple truth that every architect eventually learns. The strongest foundations are not built from concrete or steel. They are built from the courage to begin again.